Okay, let's unpack this. When you think about the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, you are engaging with an institution that is um, so much more than just a set of TV channels or radio stations.
It's a global phenomenon, really, and its history is just completely intertwined with the history of the modern British state.
It's the world's oldest and largest global public service broadcaster, headquartered, of course, at Broadcasting House in London.
And the scale is just staggering. I mean, to really grasp what we're talking about, the BBC employs over 21, almost 22,000 staff in total.
Wow.
And crucially, 17,000 of those, over 17,000, are dedicated specifically to that public sector broadcasting mission. That's an enormous footprint.
And what defines this century-old behemoth? It's that one defining, almost moralistic ethos that still guides the corporation today.
The famous Reithian directive.
Exactly, to inform, educate, and entertain. And that phrase, it's not just a slogan. It feels like a statement of moral intent that has genuinely shaped a nation.
It absolutely has. But why does that ethos, set 100 years ago, remain so controversial today? I think it's because inform, educate, and entertain requires the BBC to be a cultural and a moral arbiter.
Right. It implies that Auntie knows best.
Precisely. That's one of its famous nicknames, along with the Beeb, which was coined by Peter Sellers. That paternalistic assumption, that idea that we know what's good for you, is what puts the BBC constantly at odds with government, with its competitors, and sometimes even with its own audience.
So our mission in this deep dive is to look at the foundational decisions that really shape the BBC. We want to look at how it transitioned from a simple private company to a crown-chartered public corporation.
And how it manages its controversial and frankly unique funding structure, the license fee.
And, of course, the constant high-stakes tension around its fundamental mandate for impartiality. A tension that, as we'll see, has brought down executive leadership very, very recently.
It's a huge story. We have a mountain of history to cover.
We do. So let's start right back at the beginning, in the chaotic post-war 1920s.
The very first spark of British broadcasting that really captured the public's imagination goes back to June 1920. And this wasn't the BBC yet, not by a long shot.
No.
It was a stunning live public broadcast made from the Marconi Company factory in Chelmsford.
And this was designed purely to generate excitement. It was sponsored by the Daily Mail, and it featured one of the biggest stars of the age, the legendary Australian soprano, Dame Nellie Melba.
An absolute superstar.
She sang two arias, and the transmission was so powerful it was reportedly picked up as far away as Spain. You can just imagine the public was instantly hooked.
But official circles were
Yeah.
less than thrilled. The key problem was interference.
With military communication.
Exactly. The wavelengths they used interfered with military and civil communications. So by late 1920, the licensing authority, the General Post Office, or GPO, banned further Chelmsford broadcasts under some pretty intense pressure.
But they couldn't keep the genie in the bottle, could they?
No way. By 1922, the GPO had received nearly 100 license requests from all these different manufacturers and enthusiasts. The public demand for wireless was undeniable.
So the GPO realized they couldn't just ban broadcasting entirely. They had to control it.
And this is the crucial turning point. The GPO decided to rescind its ban after a petition from 63 different wireless societies, but their strategy was to issue only a single broadcasting license.
Just one.
Just one. And this license was given to a company jointly owned by a consortium of the leading wireless receiver manufacturers. This was the British Broadcasting Company Ltd., formed on October 18, 1922.
And this choice, this singular monopoly, was completely deliberate. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about public policy.
Yes. The GPO's explicit goal was to avoid the chaotic expansion experience in the United States.
Where you just had commercial interest leading to hundreds of competing, often low-quality, advertising-driven stations just clogging up the airways.
Exactly. Britain chose order and this idea of public service over market proliferation from the very beginning.
And to lead this singular, non-commercial operation, they needed a singular, strong personality.
Enter John Reith, a towering figure both literally and figuratively. He was a deeply committed Scottish Calvinist, and he was appointed general manager in December 1922.
And Reith's moralistic background is just absolutely critical here because it immediately shaped the entire programming philosophy. His aim wasn't just to sell radios.
Not at all. His aim was to mold the nation.
Yes. His famous standard to inform, educate, and entertain was really a prescription for cultural improvement. He believed the BBC should broadcast all that is best in every department of human knowledge, basically pushing high culture and moral rectitude onto the airwaves.
Whether the public explicitly asked for it or not.
Precisely.
But despite these very high ideals, the British Broadcasting Company started with a structurally flawed financial model.
It was a bit of a mess, wasn't it?
It was. The original plan was highly technical. Funding was supposed to come from a royalty levied on the sales of approved BBC wireless receiving sets. The ones manufactured by the consortium owners.
The problem was pure economics and human ingenuity. This system just proved entirely inadequate very, very quickly.
Because clever amateurs started building their own receivers from components.
Right, bypassing the royalty payment entirely. And then other people just bought rival unlicensed sets that didn't contribute anything to the BBC's coffers.
So you had this grand mandate, but no money to actually fulfill it.
This led to a financial deadlock, and by mid-1923, the Postmaster General commissioned what was called the Sykes Committee to find a solution.
And that committee recommended two immediate essential changes. First, a short-term reorganization of license fees with much better enforcement, giving the BBC an increased share of that revenue.
And second, the big one, the introduction of a simple universal 10-shilling license fee for long-term funding.
The committee also explicitly cemented the BBC's monopoly status and, crucially, prohibited advertising.
Now, here's a fantastic political detail that I love. Fleet Street, the powerful newspaper industry, saw radio as a direct economic threat.
Of course they did.
So they successfully lobbied the government to ban the BBC from broadcasting any news bulletins before 7 p.m. every evening.
Unbelievable.
They wanted to make absolutely sure that the public still had to buy the morning and evening papers to get any breaking news.
But that uneasy compromise was absolutely shattered just a few years later with the monumental 1926 general strike crisis.
Right. The nation is paralyzed, newspaper production temporarily grinds to a halt.
And suddenly, all the restrictions on news bulletins were waived, and the BBC instantly became the primary and, for many people, the only source of national news.
This event was just existential for Reith. He was placed in an incredibly delicate and politically charged position.
Completely. He had to maintain public trust by appearing impartial and factual, navigating this fine line between the strikers and the government.
And the Prime Minister at the time, Stanley Baldwin, he trusted Reith, but not entirely in the spirit of impartiality. Baldwin trusted him, and this is a quote, not to be really impartial.
Because he knew Reith's ultimate moral conservatism aligned with the government's need for order.
Meanwhile, you have Winston Churchill, ever the hardliner, who actually wanted to commandeer the BBC entirely.
Just take it over.
Take it over for outright government propaganda. But Baldwin very wisely overruled him. He realized that a medium that was perceived as independent would be far more effective in maintaining national calm than an overtly state-controlled voice.
They used Reith's ambition and his reputation for impartiality as a political tool.
And the public reaction was just completely polarized, which shows what a tightrope Reith was walking. Supporters of the strike, who felt the BBC's reporting leaned towards the establishment.
They bitterly nicknamed the organization the BFC.
The British Falsehood Company.
Exactly. Yet at the end of the strike, Reith clearly felt that the BBC had saved the nation from chaos. He personally marked the end of the crisis by going on air and reciting William Blake's rousing semi-religious poem, Jerusalem.
It was a declaration, wasn't it, that the British soul had been preserved thanks to broadcasting.
And that successful, high-profile navigation of a national crisis, proving that broadcasting could be a powerful tool for social stability, it cemented the national audience and Reith's political capital.
It led directly to the government accepting the Crawford Committee's recommendation to replace the private company.
And that's when the non-commercial, Crown-chartered British Broadcasting Corporation was born on January 1st, 1927.
And that's where you get the high-minded grand motto from, "Nation shall speak peace unto nation."
It says so much about the global aspirations of the newly knighted Sir John Reith, now the first Director General.
Absolutely. This event really defined the BBC, a public service funded by the public, operating under the Crown, but designed to be editorially independent of the direct government of the day, at least in theory.
And under Sir John Reith, this newly chartered corporation operated with immense power. It was effectively a moral and cultural gatekeeper for the entire nation.
His mission to broadcast all that is best and insisting on maintaining a high moral tone was absolutely paramount to his vision of social uplift.
And that moral gatekeeping translated into very specific, very stringent censorship rules, particularly for entertainers and programmers.
Oh, yeah. Up until 1928, the rules dictated that broadcasters had to strictly avoid biblical quotations, any imitation or impersonation of clergy,
References to drink, or the then raging prohibition in the U.S.
and, quote, any vulgar or doubtful matter. It was like a broadcasting service run by the local vicarage.
And culturally, they were aggressively isolationist. There was a conscious exclusion of popular foreign music and musicians in favor of promoting British alternatives.
A decision that often put the BBC at odds with young people who were, hungry for new trends and sounds from the continent and America.
And even political discourse was heavily managed, despite the BBC's charter promising editorial independence.
Right, because while the Prime Minister allowed the BBC to address matters of religious, political, or industrial controversy starting in 1928, political broadcasts were constantly monitored and vetted throughout the 1930s.
And we have some really concrete examples of this state intervention. In 1935, the BBC planned a series of 5 broadcasts featuring leaders from both political extremes.
They contracted Oswald Mosley of the British Union of Fascists, the far right, and Harry Pollitt of the Communist Party, the far left.
But the BBC, in conjunction with pressure from the Foreign Office, suspended and ultimately just canceled that series without any public announcement.
The rationale was simple. Avoid promoting instability.
And it wasn't just about the extremes. In 1938, a very prominent politician, a future wartime leader, in fact, Winston Churchill, was censored.
Really?
Yes, when he proposed a series of talks about British domestic and foreign politics. The BBC feared his criticisms of the government's appeasement policy would be far too inflammatory.
So this widespread censorship of political debate in the 1930s really created the template for the strict controls the BBC would use during the war.
Absolutely. But at the same time, the BBC was also being technologically pioneering. Experimental television broadcasts began as early as 1929.
Using the electromechanical 30-line system developed by John Logie Baird.
The technology progressed so quickly, though, and it set a global standard. The expanded BBC television service officially launched from Alexandra Palace in November 1936.
And they famously alternated between Baird's improved mechanical 240-line system and the truly revolutionary, superior, all-electronic 405-line Marconi EMI system.
And this is a really crucial technical distinction. The 405-line system was the world's first fully electronic system used in regular broadcasting.
So no more spinning discs.
No more spinning discs. Electronic scanning offered far superior resolution, stability, and image quality. Within a year, the mechanical system was dropped completely.
And the 405-line system became the backbone of British television for decades, marking the BBC as a true pioneer in modern electronic media.
But despite all this innovation, the BBC provoked deep animosity among the established media. Theaters, concert halls, the recording industry.
They all feared this new, pervasive medium. By 1929, the BBC was complaining that agents of many popular comedians flat out refused to sign broadcasting contracts.
Why was that?
They genuinely feared their material would become stale through overexposure on the radio, and that broadcasting would consequently reduce the value of the artist as a live performer in the music halls.
It's a fascinating early example, isn't it, of creative industries struggling to adapt to media saturation. The BBC, even as a monopoly, was seen by many as an economic threat to live performance and print journalism.
Which brings us to the war. When World War II broke out in September 1939, the BBC's priorities shifted overnight. Television broadcasting was immediately suspended until 1946.
The engineers were needed for the war effort.
Exactly. And radio became the vital, constant medium for national morale and communication.
And this necessitated a massive organizational shift. For safety, the BBC moved most of its essential radio operations out of London, initially to Bristol, and then consolidating in Bedford.
So key wartime broadcasts, like concerts, were delivered from the Bedford Corn Exchange, and famous religious services, including the daily service, were broadcast from the Trinity Chapel in St. Paul's Church. It was all about ensuring continuity of spiritual life during the bombings.
And the BBC's wartime staff included some very famous figures. George Orwell spent 2 years working in the Eastern Service.
The irony there is just stark. One of the 20th century's greatest critics of state control and surveillance was working inside a state-vetted, state-controlled information apparatus during a time of extreme censorship.
And the radio became the voice of leadership. Winston Churchill delivered 33 major wartime speeches via BBC Radio within the UK.
He was using this trusted medium to bypass the press and address the nation directly during the most critical moments of the war.
And internationally, the broadcasts were critical tools of resistance. Charles de Gaulle's June 18, 1940 speech, urging the French people not to capitulate.
That was broadcast by the BBC while he was in exile in London. It became a touchstone for the Free French movement.
But beneath all this inspiring rhetoric was a highly structured censorship apparatus designed by the government's Ministry of Information starting back in 1938.
The BBC European Service used shortwave technology to broadcast across Europe and gather intelligence, but the material was intensely filtered. Regional workers were strictly instructed to avoid adding anything outside the preordained news items.
And the censorship was often dictated by foreign policy needs rather than pure security. The BBC Polish service provides a really grim illustration of this.
It was heavily censored, wasn't it?
Heavily, due to fears of jeopardizing relations with the Soviet Union, who were a key, if unreliable, ally. So controversial topics that could anger Moscow.
Like the contested Polish and Soviet border, the mass deportations of Polish citizens, the arrests of Polish Home Army members.
All of it was completely excluded from Polish broadcasts.
And the most famous example is the Katyn massacre. Despite strong evidence emerging during the war that Soviet forces, not Nazis, were responsible for the mass murder of Polish officers.
The BBC Polish service was explicitly ordered to ignore or downplay the subject to maintain the political alliance. It just demonstrates that constant tension between public service journalism and the state's strategic imperatives.
And the control even extended to the arts. By 1940, music by composers from enemy nations, Germany, Austria, and Italy, was censored across all BBC broadcasts.
The reasoning being that the audience would be irritated by hearing the cultural output of the enemy.
The blacklists were precise. 99 German, 38 Austrian, and 38 Italian composers were excluded from the airwaves.
And this brings us back to the issue of political vetting, which actually predates the war. In 1937, long before Pearl Harbor or the Blitz, an MI5 security officer was given a permanent office inside the BBC.
A permanent office?
Yes. This officer's job was to examine the files of potential job applicants, blacklisting anyone deemed a security risk, often on, spurious grounds, based on associations with pacifist, communist, or fascist ideologies.
So this formalized a relationship of state intrusion that would then expand significantly during the Cold War.
Following the war, television finally resumed in June 1946, and there's that great Irby myth.
Right, that the announcer Leslie Mitchell started by saying, "As I was saying before, we were so rudely interrupted."
But the sources confirmed that the return was actually much softer. The service resumed with announcer Jasmine Bligh saying, "Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Bligh?"
A friendly, slightly nostalgic re-entry into national life.
And the BBC enjoyed a television broadcast monopoly for another 9 years, but everything changed in 1955.
With the arrival of the commercial competitor, Independent Television, ITV, this marked the official end of the BBC's singular dominance and forced it to adapt to commercial realities.
However, the BBC received a major boost in prestige from the 1962 Pilkington Committee report.
And what did that report find?
Well, it was a huge validation for the BBC's public service model. It praised the BBC for the sheer quality and depth of its output, while simultaneously criticizing ITV pretty heavily for prioritizing populist programming and lacking sufficient quality.
So this political validation was critical. It led directly to the award of a second television channel to the BBC.
BBC Two, which launched in 1964, the existing service was renamed BBC One.
And BBC Two was technologically advanced, wasn't it? It used the higher resolution 625-line European standard, and crucially, it became the first channel to broadcast regularly in color, starting in 1967.
That really established BBC Two as the home for experimental, high-quality, and niche programming, distinct from the mass-market BBC One.
Meanwhile, the radio landscape was undergoing its own revolution.
The pirate radio station.
Exactly. Starting in 1964, unauthorized pirate radio stations, most famously Radio Caroline, took to the international waters and blasted continuous advertising-backed pop music directly to the British youth.
This proved that the BBC's traditional channels were completely failing to meet the demand for popular culture.
So the government was ultimately forced to regulate, and the BBC responded with a massive strategic internal radio reorganization in 1967.
They fundamentally rebranded their channels to compete directly with the pirates and the new commercial services.
So the old Light program, which used to have a bit of everything, was split into Radio 1 for continuous popular music aimed at a young audience.
And Radio 2 for easy listening.
The Sirius Cultural Third program became Radio 3 for classical content, and the home service was rebranded as Radio 4, the dedicated home for news, drama, and speech-based content.
And this upheaval also led to the long overdue establishment of local BBC radio stations across the UK.
Beyond reorganization, the BBC continued to innovate technically. It introduced the teletext service CFAX in 1974.
Initially designed for subtitling for the deaf, but it rapidly developed into a text-based news and information service.
They were also responsible for developing the INI-CAM stereo standard, which significantly improved the sound quality of broadcast television.
But by the 1980s and 90s, the BBC faced increasing competition from commercial satellite and cable services. It was clear that the license fee alone could not sustain the corporation's ambitions,
Which forced some necessary compromises with commercialization.
This led to the aggressive commercial exploitation of their intellectual property. BBC Enterprises, which had existed since 1969 to handle merchandise, was relaunched as the more globally ambitious BBC Worldwide in 1995.
This was all about leveraging British cultural output, from Shakespeare adaptations to comedies, and selling it globally.
And they continued this trend with internal operational structures. In 1998, they spun off Operational Arms Studios, outside broadcasts, post-production design, costumes, even wigs.
Wigs?
Wigs into BBC Resources Ltd. The idea was that these units could generate additional revenue by providing services externally while feeding that income back into the public service programming budget.
And this era also saw the leap into the digital age, with the launch of new services catering to niche audiences.
This included the crucial news and sport-focused Radio 5 Live, which replaced the old Radio 5.
Right, that was after the BBC realized the immense public appetite for continuous news coverage following the success of Radio 4's Gulf War coverage in 1991.
We also saw the introduction of the rolling news channel BBC News 24, alongside BBC Choice and the educational BBC Knowledge Channel.
But what really ties all these eras together is the incredible longevity of the cultural landmarks created under the BBC umbrella.
You're talking about things like Desert Island Discs.
Exactly, which have been running on radio since 1942, where celebrities are asked what music they would take to a desert island. It's a profound sociological window into British life.
And what about Sports Report? Since January 1948, it holds the record as the world's longest-running sports radio program.
Then there's The Archers, the rural soap opera that debuted in 1951 and is the world's longest-running drama.
And on the TV side, you have Panorama, broadcasting since 1953, the world's longest-running news television program, known for its deep investigative journalism, despite often generating enormous controversy.
These long-running shows aren't just entertainment. They are the reliable fixtures woven into the very fabric of British daily life, demonstrating the consistent delivery of the entertain and inform parts of the mandate.
Moving into the 21st century, this brought a major digital reckoning for the BBC. The early 2000s saw a comprehensive digital refresh of the TV channels.
In 2002, BBC Knowledge was replaced by the critically acclaimed BBC 4, focusing heavily on arts, documentaries, and high culture imports.
Children's broadcasting was also modernized. Children's BBC was split into CBBC for older children and CBeebies for preschoolers, recognizing the different needs of distinct young audiences, and each got its own dedicated digital channel.
The digital radio landscape also expanded dramatically, aiming to capture audiences overlooked by the main services.
So you get new stations like One Extra, specializing in modern black music, 6 Music for alternative genres, and Radio 4 Extra for archiving and repurposing classic speech, comedy, and drama content.
But this expansion, ironically, coincided with massive financial pressures, partly driven by the increased cost of running so many new digital services.
This led to the intense Creative Futures project in 2005 and then Delivering Creative Futures in 2007, which were driven by a reported £2 billion funding shortfall across the corporation.
And these cuts were severe and highly visible. The plans resulted in a reduction of 2,500 jobs, a 10% reduction in overall programming output.
And the emotionally charged decision to sell the iconic television center in London,
which had served as the corporation's flagship headquarters since 1960. It signaled that no part of the BBC was sacred in the face of financial necessity.
And crucially, this period saw a massive geographic shift designed to decentralize the corporation away from London's expensive center.
So while major departments like News and National Radio consolidated into the refurbished Broadcasting House, others were moved entirely to the north of England.
We're talking about a major logistical operation. Large numbers of staff, particularly in sport, children's, and Radio 5 Live, were relocated to the new Media City UK development in Salford, near Manchester.
This created the BBC North Group division, which became the biggest staffing operation outside of London, attempting to fulfill a mandate for regional representation while simultaneously cutting costs.
Which brings us to the BBC's unique financial mechanism. It remains the single biggest source of current political and cultural debate: the annual television license fee.
As of April 2024, the fee stands at £169.50 per household. And this fee is required legally for anyone receiving live broadcast television or using the BBC streaming service, iPlayer.
And it is absolutely essential to stress that this is not a voluntary subscription.
No.
It's set by the government, approved by Parliament, and is classified legally as a tax, specifically a hypothecated tax, which means the revenue must be spent on the BBC.
And this is where the controversy escalates dramatically. Enforcement.
Fee collection and enforcement are managed under the trading name TV Licensing, which is subcontracted to the private sector company Capita, and evasion of this fee is a criminal offense.
The enforcement arm is known for its aggressive tactics.
The collection methods are often highly intrusive. They conduct surveillance utilizing the controversial regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000 or IIPA 2000.
And this is significant. RIPA is a law originally designed for serious national security investigations and anti-terrorism efforts, but it permits the use of surveillance technology and search warrants to track down alleged license fee evaders.
And the consequence of this aggressive enforcement is stark. In 2018-19 alone, 216,900 people were caught evading the fee.
Wow.
And evasion made up about 1/10 of all cases prosecuted in magistrates' courts in England and Wales. This means the BBC funding model directly contributes significantly to the burden on the criminal justice system.
This aggressive collection, coupled with reports of Capita sending inaccurate or threatening letters, leads to major public criticism. We have to ask, is it appropriate to criminalize non-payment of a media subscription in the 21st century?
Especially when viewers can access vast amounts of alternative, non-tax-funded content like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and YouTube.
The public and political pressure to decriminalize the evasion or scrap the fee entirely has never been higher.
And those financial pressures are real and escalating due to shifting viewing habits. In 2023, 500,000 UK households canceled their TV license.
Which is a direct result of viewers realizing they can avoid the fee if they only watch on-demand services that are not the iPlayer.
Exactly. The total number of paying households dropped to 23.9 million, resulting in shrinking real terms revenue for the corporation.
So to counter this domestic decline, the BBC relies very heavily on its commercial arm, BBC Studios.
This is a wholly owned commercial subsidiary formed by merging the production arm and BBC Worldwide in 2018, and it's responsible for exploiting the corporation's valuable intellectual property for international sales, production services, and merchandise.
And these commercial activities contribute hundreds of millions in additional income every year.
And the key to their success is this portfolio of super brands generated from BBC IP. You're talking about the global phenomenon Doctor Who, the massive automobile franchise Top Gear,
and the reality format Strictly Come Dancing, which is exported as Dancing with the Stars to over 60 countries. This commercial revenue is absolutely vital to sustaining the public service output.
But while domestic funding is so fraught with controversy, the BBC's global footprint is undisputed, largely thanks to the BBC World Service.
It provides news and current affairs in over 40 languages, reaching an audience in over 150 capital cities.
It is, by audience reach and reception area, the world's largest external broadcaster, claiming an estimated weekly audience of 192 million people.
But its funding has changed significantly, which impacts its perceived independence abroad. Since 2014, the World Service has been funded by the UK domestic license fee, moving away from being funded directly by the Foreign Office.
That shift is so important because it was intended to demonstrate greater editorial independence from the government, especially when broadcasting into politically sensitive regions. It enforces the idea that it serves the British public, not the Foreign Secretary.
Digitally, the BBC is a powerhouse. BBC Online is claimed to be Europe's most popular content-based site, attracting 13.2 million daily UK visitors.
And domestically, it's funded by the license fee, but crucially, it carries advertising when viewed outside the UK. It uses GeoIP technology to differentiate the free public service from the commercial operation.
But the real game changer domestically was the launch of BBC iPlayer in 2007.
It initially used some quite complicated P2P and DRM technology, but it evolved very quickly into the modern streaming platform we know today.
It allows users to watch almost all TV and radio output live and for catch-up viewing. And the fact that the license fee is now required to access iPlayer is critical to justifying the fee's existence in this multi-channel world.
And to compete globally with American streaming services like Netflix and Hulu, the BBC co-launched the international streaming service BritBox in 2017.
Initially partnering with ITV and later incorporating Channel 4 content.
Right. BritBox offers a massive, curated catalog of classic British TV shows abroad, attempting to capture the diaspora audience and prevent American giants from monopolizing classic UK IP.
And looking ahead, we are facing the biggest institutional shift since the introduction of television itself. The Director General, Tim Davie, announced in May 2025 the staggering plan to switch off traditional broadcast transmissions completely in the 2030s.
A transition entirely to a fully online delivery model.
It forces the corporation to fundamentally redefine what it means to be a universal public service when its delivery mechanism is entirely dependent on internet infrastructure.
It's a massive commitment, and it brings us directly to the issues of governance and the persistent debate that threatens to derail its future: impartiality.
So the BBC is structured as a chartered corporation, deliberately set up to be independent from direct government intervention. It operates under a royal charter.
That's its constitutional basis. It outlines its mission, its public purposes, and the governance framework.
The current charter, which took effect in 2017 and is set to expire in December 2027, emphasizes public service, sets limits on editorial independence, and crucially, prohibits advertising on domestic services.
It reinforces that non-commercial nature of its core mission.
And governance is complex. It's changed over the years to try and increase accountability. The BBC board, which replaced the old BBC Trust in 2017, sets the overall strategy and ensures the BBC meets its public purposes.
And it appoints the Director General. External regulation falls to Ofcom, the UK's regulator for communications.
The current leadership includes Samir Shah as the chairman, who is responsible for the board's strategic oversight, and Tim Davie as the Director General.
And Davie chairs the executive committee and acts as the chief executive and editor-in-chief responsible for day-to-day operations and editorial standards.
But to understand the tension between the BBC and the state, we have to revisit a deeply shocking historical policy: the MI5 vetting operation, designed to keep out subversives.
This practice ran from the mid-1930s all the way until the 1990s.
And this wasn't a casual arrangement. It was a formal, systematic process starting around 1935, where MI5 secretly vetted job applicants, particularly for sensitive roles, checking their political views without their knowledge or consent.
For decades, the BBC, an institution dedicated to informing the public, publicly denied the existence of this intrusive state relationship.
The true horror of this policy was revealed in a sensational expose in The Observer in August 1985. MI5 operatives didn't just check files remotely.
No, they ran operations directly from Room 105 in Broadcasting House, the BBC's own headquarters. They had a physical presence embedded deep within the public service broadcaster, silently vetting candidates.
A 1984 internal memo later exposed the sheer scale and political breadth of the blacklisting.
The specific organizations targeted spanned the entire political spectrum, from far-left groups like the Communist Party of Great Britain, the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Militant Tendency,
all the way to far-right organizations like the National Front and the British National Party.
An association with any of these was often grounds for secret rejection from a job.
This detail provides such a critical lens through which to view the BBC's long history of political compromise. I mean, how can an organization claim strict political impartiality when, for decades, the state was actively ensuring its internal ranks were politically homogenous?
Or at least free of activists on either extreme.
Following the public revelation in 1985, the BBC was forced to restrict the policy, limiting vetting only to those in top executive roles or staff with access to genuinely secret government information.
Like those involved in emergency wartime broadcasting planning, it was further restricted in 1990 after the Security Service Act 1989, and the files detailing this long and complex betrayal of trust were eventually sent to the BBC archives.
And this history brings us directly to the core modern controversy. The BBC is constantly caught in a crossfire of claims about political bias, making the idea of impartiality an almost unattainable standard.
Historically, the claims of bias most often came from the conservative right. Margaret Thatcher, for example, notoriously considered the BBC's news coverage during the Falklands War and the miners' strike to be biased and irresponsible.
And this criticism gained internal weight when former BBC presenters publicly confirmed the perception. Peter Sissons, a main news presenter for 2 decades, claimed in 2011 that at the core of the BBC, in its very DNA, is a way of thinking that is firmly of the left.
And Andrew Marr also commented that the BBC has a liberal bias, not so much a party political bias, better expressed as a cultural liberal bias.
Even a recent chairman, Richard Sharp, admitted in 2022 that the BBC does have a liberal bias, but claimed the institution was fighting against it.
But the counterclaims, arguing the BBC leans right, are equally strong, particularly citing the employment of high-profile political figures and advisors.
Right. Left-wing columnist Owen Jones, writing for The Guardian, argued that the BBC is stacked full of right-wingers, pointing to the employment of figures like the ultra-Thatcherite Andrew Neil as a senior politics presenter.
And we saw high-profile accusations of direct political interference in 2022. The former Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis alleged that a BBC board member, Robbie Gibb, who is a former conservative advisor to Theresa May,
she alleged he was acting as an active agent of the Conservative Party and was shaping news output,
which raised serious questions about whether the governance structure itself was being politically weaponized.
And the public is just deeply divided on this issue, confirming the BBC's impossible position. A 2018 opinion poll by BMG Research found that 40% of the British public view the BBC as politically partisan,
with an almost even split. 20% believing it leans left and 20% believing it leans right.
That polarization just shows that the problem is fundamentally one of perception, where no matter what the BBC reports, half the audience will inevitably feel it is politically motivated.
And this structural tension over impartiality has culminated in recent, highly destabilizing executive crises.
The year 2023 saw the major controversy involving the football pundit Gary Lineker.
He was temporarily suspended after he criticized the government's asylum policy on social media, which sparked a massive internal and external debate over whether non-news employees must adhere to impartiality standards.
And this scandal was amplified because of the immediate resignation of the then chairman, Richard Sharp.
Right. Sharp himself resigned after a report found he failed to disclose a potential perceived conflict of interest related to facilitating a large loan for former Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
The perception of a deep, inappropriate connection between the Conservative Party establishment and the BBC's governance structure caused a very serious lapse in public trust.
And the final critical event noted in our source material is the executive crisis in November 2025. Following the leak of a confidential report alleging systemic bias within the news division.
Both Director General Tim Davie and Deborah Turnus, the CEO of News, resigned.
And that leaked report centered partly on the highly contested controversy over the editing of a Donald Trump speech, demonstrating how high-stakes editorial decisions involving international politics can lead directly to the collapse of top leadership within the corporation.
It just confirms that the issue of political bias is not merely theoretical or historical. It is existential. It poses the single greatest threat to the BBC's mandate and stability today.
What stands out to me across this entire deep dive is that the BBC's history is a story of constant struggle. The struggle to maintain a public service mandate, the struggle to fund that mandate through a highly controversial tax,
and the struggle to survive the political firestorm that inevitably comes with attempting to be an impartial voice for a polarized nation. The BBC is so much more than just a media company.
It's a massive producer of global cultural touchstones.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the BBC Studios Natural History Unit, based in Bristol, which remains the largest wildlife documentary production house in the world. It's responsible for the landmark works of Sir David Attenborough.
Or consider the long-running partnership with Wimbledon, which began on radio in 1927 and on television in 1937, making it the longest-running partnership in sports broadcasting history.
And we always come back to those shows that just defy time, those anchors of British culture. Desert Island Discs since 1942, Sports Report since 48, The Archer since 51, and Panorama since 53.
They show the incredible durability of that Ruthian vision, even if the execution has always been imperfect.
So what does this all mean for the future? We have this massive institution, perpetually grappling with financial deficits, intense political scrutiny from both sides, and leadership collapsing over impartiality scandals.
The core mission is clear: but the delivery mechanism is about to vanish.
This brings us to the final, provocative thought that builds on that major announcement from Director General Tim Davie in May 2025. The plan to switch off traditional broadcast transmissions entirely in the 2030s for a fully online delivery model.
The BBC was founded a century ago on the physical act of transmitting radio waves and later television signals to the entire nation, guaranteeing universal access via infrastructure funded by the license fee.
So if that foundational method is completely eliminated, if the entire public service operation exists exclusively online, how will the core mandate of being a universal public service broadcaster, accessible to all citizens, be defined?
What happens to the elderly, the poor, or those in rural areas with unreliable broadband?
The next Great Charter debate won't be about bias or funding methods. It will be about connectivity. A century of informing, educating, and entertaining, all boiling down to how they ensure the digital plug is accessible to everyone. That is the existential question facing the BBC.